In this study, the researchers wanted to develop scales that measure anxiety that is experienced in social settings. Social evaluative anxiety was defined as the experience of distress, discomfort, fear, anxiety, etc. in social situations, as the deliberate avoidance of social situations, and as a fear of receiving negative evaluations from others. The first 2 points were used to compose a social avoidance and distress scale, SAD, and the last point was used to compose a fear of negative evaluation scale, FNE. The researchers had three goals in mind when developing the scales. They wanted to minimize response errors, promote scale similarity, and to develop correlational relationships with other scales. The first experiment was SAD, and the prospect of working alone or together. In this experiment, the researchers predicted that those high on SAD would be uncomfortable in social situations. So the researchers told the participants that after the first experiment, they would have to either participate in a group discussion or write an essay alone. The effect of these groups on the participant was measured through their performance, anxiety, and attitude. The participants were randomly selected to low anxious or high anxious groups based on their SAD score. And then from these groups, they were randomly assigned to either an essay or discussion group. The participants then all took an intelligence test, and it was expected that a participant's anxiousness would impair their performance on the test. After the test, the participants filled out a questionnaire, and then they were told that the second experiment could not take place now. Participants were then asked how interested they were in returning for the second experiment. All significant results came from the questionnaire. Participants' anxiety had no effect on their intelligence test performance. The high anxious group was less interested in returning. The difference between the essay and the discussion groups was significant. The high anxious group was less interested in returning if they were in the discussion group. The low anxious group were less interested in returning if they were going to be in the essay group. The high anxious group was more worried about the second experiment, and the essay group produced more concern than the discussion group. The high anxious participants expected to be more nervous, less calm, and more confident if they're going to be in the essay group, while anxious participants were the opposite. The second experiment was SAD, and being alone or together. The researchers used the same distribution of SAD scores and randomly assigned them to work alone or together, either not physically together and not talking, or physically together and talking. The tasks were anagrams, risk level, and the learning of paired associative nonsense syllables. The experiment produced results in the predicted directions, but not significant, to show anxiety's effects on performance. But the data supported SAD as shown with the participants' reports of how much they talked to others. Not talking was seen as a social avoidance. The third experiment was FNE, approval seeking or disapproval avoiding. A person high on the FNE scale might try to gain social approval by avoiding disapproval. In addition, those high on FNE are expected to be most affected by disapproval, and those low are expected to be most affected by gaining approval. Those participants high on FNE avoided disapproval and sought approval, while the low FNE participants did not seek approval, and were only motivated if disapproval was threatened. Those high on FNE reported more uneasiness during the experiment. All the high FNE participants were in the approval condition, while the low FNE participants were divided between approval and disapproval. The fourth experiment was correlational studies. The SAD and FNE scales were correlated with other measures. Only a measure of state anxiety in social situations correlated with behavior in those situations. A scale measuring social avoidance would have to be negatively correlated with affiliation, and the SAD met this criterion. The high correlation of FNE and social approval was consistent with the results of the third experiment, suggesting that people high in FNE are concerned with gaining others' approval. People high on FNE tend to be defensive, not autonomous, not dominant, and self-effacing. Those high on SAD were sufficiently afraid of their professor and are more conforming than others. In conclusion, people high on SAD scale avoided social situations and were anxious in social interactions. Those high on FNE were nervous in evaluative conditions and seek social approval. They both showed correlations with other measures. To generalize, the researchers' findings FNE could be used in evaluative studies, whereas SAD could be used in social interaction studies. In addition, many factors influence a person's anxiety, including the situation, the sex of the person, the conditions, and the person's levels of anxiety. In conclusion, these scales were devised to study the interactions of personality and social variables as shown here.